There is a rock in Wyoming that rises nearly 900 feet straight out of the prairie, its sides scarred with vertical grooves so uniform, so deliberate, that early geologists struggled to explain them with science alone. Long before it had a name on any map, the people who lived beneath its shadow had already explained it. They said the marks were claws. They said a bear made them. And if you stand at the base of that rock today, craning your neck toward a sky that seems impossibly far away, you might understand why that story has survived for longer than anyone can prove. This is a journey into the parts of the American landscape where legend and geography are the same thing. Not myths locked away in books, but stories that are still standing, still visible, still capable of raising the hair on the back of your neck if you know where to look and what happened there. For places. For stories. Each one older than the country that now claims the land they sit on, and each one carrying a truth that doesn't need to be literal to be real. We begin in northeastern Wyoming, at a formation the United States Geological Survey classifies as an igneous intrusion, but which the Kiowa, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, and at least 20 other indigenous nations have called something far more personal for thousands of years. Most of them call it, in one language or another, Bear Lodge. The federal government calls it Devil's Tower, a name that was never chosen by the people who lived there first, and one that many tribal members still consider both inaccurate and disrespectful, born out of a mistranslation during an 1875 expedition when an interpreter rendered a Lakota phrase meaning something closer to Bear's House into English as Bad God's Tower. But names are only the surface of this story. What matters is what the rock is said to remember. According to a version of the story told among the Kiowa, 7 sisters were once playing with their brother in a forest when the boy suddenly transformed into a giant bear, driven mad by forces the story does not fully explain, only that he was no longer himself, and he was no longer safe to be near. The sisters ran. The bear chased them across the plains, and just as his claws were about to reach them, the girls scrambled onto a low rock and prayed to it, begging it to save them. The rock heard them. It rose beneath their feet, lifting them higher and higher into the sky, faster than the bear could climb, even as his claws tore deep, parallel grooves into the stone in his desperate attempt to reach them. Those grooves, the story says, are the very ridges you can see on Devil's Tower today. And the sisters themselves, the story continues, kept rising until they became the 7 stars of the Pleiades, forever out of reach, forever watching over the land below. It's the kind of story that sounds, to modern ears, like folklore designed to soothe a child before bed. But look closer, and something else emerges. This isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about protection, about the land itself intervening on behalf of the vulnerable, about a family fractured by something inexplicable and a natural world that responds with mercy rather than indifference. It's also, geologists will tell you, a startlingly intuitive explanation for something they themselves only fully understood in the 20th century, the columnar jointing that creates those vertical ridges, a process caused by magma cooling and contracting deep underground millions of years before any human eye ever saw it break the surface. Did the people who first told this story know they were describing volcanic cooling patterns? Almost certainly not in those terms. But they were describing something true about the rock in front of them, using the only language available to explain the unexplainable, and in doing so, they created something that has outlasted almost every other kind of record from that era. No photograph. No written account. Just a story, carried mouth to mouth for possibly thousands of years, still repeated today by park rangers standing at the very base of the tower. Devil's Tower became the first national monument in the United States in 1906, a designation made by Theodore Roosevelt under the newly passed Antiquities Act. For decades afterward, it was treated primarily as a geological curiosity, a place for climbers and campers, its indigenous history reduced to a plaque or a footnote. It wasn't until sustained advocacy from tribal nations in the late 20th century that the National Park Service began actively working with native communities to reintroduce their history and living relationship with the site, including a voluntary climbing closure every June, during a month considered sacred by many of the tribes who still travel there for ceremony. Some climbers respect it. Others do not. The tension between recreation and reverence at Devil's Tower is, in many ways, a small and ongoing test of whether America is willing to treat indigenous sacred sites as something more than scenery. But Wyoming is only the beginning. Because if you travel roughly 900 miles southwest, into the red rock heart of northeastern Arizona, you'll find a formation with its own story, one that reaches even further back, into the very origin of how the Navajo, or Dine, people say weaving itself came into the world. Inside Canyon de Chelly, a canyon so deep and so old that its walls have been continuously inhabited for nearly 5,000 years, longer than almost anywhere else on the North American continent, there rises a sandstone spire that seems to grow directly out of the canyon floor, climbing 800 feet toward the rim. It is called Spider Rock, and according to Dine tradition, it is the home of Spider Woman, or Naashji, one of the most significant figures in Navajo cosmology. It was Spider Woman, the story goes, who taught the first Navajo people the art of weaving on a loom built from the elements themselves, its crosspoles made of sky and earth cord, its heddles strung with sun rays, using a spindle carved from a streak of lightning. In some tellings, it was Spider Woman who helped guide the Dine people up through the different worlds of creation, offering wisdom at moments when the path forward wasn't clear. She is not a villain in this story. She is a teacher, a protector, a figure whose gift, weaving, became one of the defining artistic and economic traditions of an entire people, one that continues today in Navajo textiles recognized around the world for their intricacy and meaning. And yet the same spire carries a second, sharper warning, one that generations of Navajo parents have used to teach children about behavior and consequence. According to this telling, if a child misbehaves, Spider Woman may come down from her home atop the rock to carry them back up to the top. Look closely at the rock summit, elders would tell children, and you might see something pale near the peak. That, they said, was the bleached bones of children who did not listen. It's a stark image, and to an outside listener it might sound purely cautionary, even harsh. But within the broader context of Spider Woman's role as both teacher and guardian, the warning carries a different weight. It reflects a worldview in which the sacred and the disciplinary are not separate categories, in which the same being who gave humanity one of its most important skills is also responsible for keeping its youngest members safe, even if that means frightening them into caution. Canyon de Chelly itself is treacherous terrain, with sheer drops and unstable footing in places, and a child's fear of Spider Woman may have, quite literally, kept them alive. Today, Canyon de Chelly National Monument remains almost entirely owned by the Navajo Nation, a rare arrangement in the American park system, where most indigenous sacred lands were seized outright. Families still live and farm within the canyon walls, much as they have for centuries, and Spider Rock remains one of the most photographed formations in the American Southwest, its story told to millions of visitors a year, most of whom have no idea they are looking at what may be the literal birthplace of an entire artistic tradition, according to the people who have called this canyon home the longest. From the deserts of the Southwest, the story shifts north, toward colder water and a different kind of fear. Because if Spider Woman represents guidance mixed with warning, the next figure in this story represents something closer to pure, ancient dread, one that lived not on land, but beneath it, in the deepest and coldest water in North America. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, so vast that early European explorers sometimes mistook its shoreline for the edge of an inland sea. It is also, according to Ojibwe tradition, home to a being called Mishipeshu, sometimes translated as the Great Lynx, sometimes as the Underwater Panther, a name that captures only part of a creature described across generations as having the head and paws of a great cat, the horns of a deer or a serpent, and a body covered in scales, its long tail thrashing with enough force to churn the deepest waters into storms. Mishipeshu was not considered evil in any simple sense. It was considered powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous to disrespect, a guardian of the copper deposits that line parts of the lake's shoreline, deposits that indigenous peoples in the region had been mining for tools and trade for as long as 6,000 years before European contact, making it one of the oldest continuously used metal sources on the planet. To take that copper without proper respect and ceremony, according to tradition, was to risk Mishipeshu's fury, a fury capable of capsizing canoes, drowning travelers, and stirring the sudden, violent storms that Lake Superior is still infamous for today. Even now, meteorologists and sailors alike recognize the lake's genuine reputation for producing waves that seem to appear from nowhere, powerful enough to have sunk hundreds of ships across recorded history, including, most famously, the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald in November of 1975, a wreck that claimed all 29 crew members and became the subject of one of the most well-known songs in American folk music. No one is suggesting Mishipeshu sank that ship. But the story of a creature capable of summoning sudden, deadly violence from calm water endured for centuries before modern meteorology could explain exactly why Lake Superior behaves the way it does, why its temperature differences and depth create conditions capable of producing rogue waves that catch even experienced sailors by surprise. There is physical evidence, too, not of the creature itself, but of the belief in it. Along parts of the Canadian shoreline near Lake Superior Provincial Park, pictographs believed to be centuries old still mark the rock faces at a site called Agawa Rock, including an image widely interpreted as a depiction of Mishipeshu itself, painted using a mixture of red ochre and, according to tradition, sturgeon oil to bind the pigment to the stone. These are not reproductions. They are considered to be among the most significant surviving examples of Ojibwe pictographic art still in their original location, accessible today only by walking along a narrow, weather-beaten stretch of rock at the lake's edge, often with waves breaking just feet away, a viewing experience that requires visitors to physically confront the same unpredictable water the legend was born from. Even the copper itself tells part of the story. Native copper from the Lake Superior region has been found in archaeological sites as far away as the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard, evidence of trade networks that stretched across nearly the entire continent, long before any European ship reached American shores. And here is where the story takes an unexpected turn toward the scientific, because the ghostly creaking sound is not, in fact, invention. Enchanted Rock genuinely produces audible groaning and popping noises, a phenomenon geologists now attribute to the extreme temperature swings the exposed granite dome experiences between scorching Texas days and rapidly cooling nights, causing the rock to expand and contract, creating small fractures and shifts that produce sound. It's a real, measurable, physical event, one that any visitor camping on the rock today can still sometimes hear for themselves, and one that had a fully supernatural explanation for the people who heard it centuries before thermal expansion was ever written into a geology textbook. Once again, a legend turns out to be a scientifically accurate observation, dressed in the only explanatory language available at the time. For places. For stories. A bear that never stopped chasing, a spider who taught an entire people to weave, a creature beneath the water demanding respect for what it protected, and a rock that groans in the dark for reasons that turned out to be true after all. None of these stories were ever meant to be museum pieces. They were living explanations, passed down through direct transmission from elder to child, adjusted and retold across generations, carrying both practical warning and spiritual meaning at the same time. What's remarkable isn't just that they survived colonization, forced relocation, boarding schools designed explicitly to erase indigenous language and belief, and centuries of being dismissed as primitive superstition by outsiders. What's remarkable is how often, when you actually examine the physical world these stories describe, you find something true underneath the myth. A rock that really was shaped by forces beyond ancient understanding. A lake that really does turn violent without warning. A mountain that really does make sound in the dead of night. Maybe that's the deeper story hiding inside all four of these legends. Not that ancient peoples were naive, reaching for supernatural answers because they lacked better ones. But that they were paying closer attention to the land than almost anyone does today, closely enough to notice patterns, dangers, and truths that it would take Western science hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years to formally catch up to. The stories were never really separate from the facts. They were simply a different way of holding them. Devil's Tower still stands in Wyoming, its grooves catching the evening light exactly as they have for millions of years. Spider Rock still rises from Canyon de Chelly, its summit hidden in shadow. Lake Superior still turns without warning, and somewhere beneath its cold surface, the copper that started it all still sits in the rock, waiting. And Enchanted Rock, on a clear Texas night, when the temperature finally drops after a hot day, still makes its sound. The next time you find yourself standing somewhere old, somewhere that feels like it's holding its breath, it might be worth asking the question the people who lived there first were already asking, long before any of us arrived: what does this place remember, and what is it still trying to tell us? If you had grown up near one of these places, hearing these stories as a child instead of discovering them as an adult, do you think you'd have believed them, or do you think it would have taken standing at the rock yourself to feel it?